In this video, we are going to talk about flags and standards that existed in ancient India. So when we talk about the flags and standards, I think it is important to first understand the terminologies that are used. So most of us are familiar with the terms Dhwaj and Pataka. So what we find is that these two terms also appear in our sources. Now, in order to understand these two terms, we have to first understand that there was an important difference between these two terms. So if we take the example of Mahabharata, we find that in Mahabharata, Pataka is used for banners. And in most cases, these were decorative banners. So this term is not used for flags per se. Now, when we move to the term Dhwaja, we find that it is a broader term. So Dhwaj would include the pole and also the banner on which the particular standard is inscribed. So this flag or a banner on which the standard is inscribed is called Dhwaj Pataka. So what we find is that Dhwaj has the pole and also the banner included in it. So in this sense, we say that Dhwaja is a broader term. Now, interestingly, what we see is that the term Dhwaja itself evolved. So initially, we see that the term Dhwaja is not used for poles and flags. Instead, it is used for a totem. So to give you an example, we have the Vishnu Dharmottar Purana. So in this Puran, we have a story in which we are told that the Devas were losing the battle against the Asuras. So they go to Lord Narayan and they ask for help. So Lord Narayan gives them a Dhwaja. And we are told that under the protection of this Dhwaja, the Devas won against the Asuras. So what we see is that here, the description of Dhwaja does not suggest that it was a banner of sorts. Instead, it appears that it was some type of a totem. Now, apart from this Purana, we have also some reference from the Vedic literature. So in the Vedic literature, we have a reference in which we are told that the priests have raised the Dhwaja as a pole. So here again, what we see is that this reference does not suggest that Dhwaj here means a flag or a banner. So this, I think, is an important point that we should keep in mind. Now, when we move to the epic period, so when we talk about Mahabharata, for example, we find that here the reference to Dhwajas has become more concrete. And interestingly, what we also see is that here there is no common Dhwaja that appears. So for example, when we talk about the Kaurava side, we find that there was no common Kaurava Dhwaja. Instead, every warrior has its own Dhwaja. So for example, when we look at the Dhwaja of Duryodhan, he has the Dhwaja whose standard was a serpent. Now when we talk about Bhishma, we have the standard of the Tal tree or the toddy palm tree. Dronacharya, on the other hand, has the standard of an altar that is covered with deer skin, and on top of it there is a water jar. So these are some of the different types of Dhwaja which we see on the Kaurava side. Now when we move to the Pandava side, we find that, for example, we all know the Dhwaja of Arjun. Now when we talk about Ghatotkacha, Ghatotkacha has the standard of a vulture. Then Bhim has the standard of a lion or Simha. So these are the different Dhwajas which we see in Mahabharata. Now coming to the Mahajanpat period, in Panini's Ashtadhyayi we have a reference. So Panini tells us that the Sanghas of this period had different Lakshan, which is symbol, and Ank, which is mark. So here what we see is that this was some type of reference to a particular insignia or a standard. Now we do not have enough reference to suggest that what these Ank or Lakshana was, but most likely these were similar to that of the standards or Dhwajas which we see in the epic period. So this is what we see in the Mahajanpat period. Now when we move to the period when Alexander invaded India, we find that in the classical accounts there is an important reference. So here we are told that when Porus marched his army to meet Alexander, in the front of the army there was a standard bearer who was carrying the image of Heracles. Now, Heracles, most scholars believe, was Lord Krishna. So I'm not going to go into the debate about who Heracles was, but what appears to be the case is that there was this concept of standard that was well established during this period. Now, this can also be seen from Kautilya's Arthashastra. So, Kautilya tells us that in the military expedition, soldiers should carry portable standards. So this would increase their morale and it would also help in fighting. So this is what we see in Arthashastra. So here again we find that there was a concept of standard that was present in ancient India. Now up until this point we have only talked about the reference that comes from literary sources. But when we talk about the period of postmodern period, we find that we have some sculpture reference also. So for example, we have the famous sculpture from Barhut that depicts a soldier who is on a horse carrying the standard of a Garud. So this is an important source for us when we talk about flags and standards in ancient India. And apart from this, we have from Sanchi the reference of Triratna Dhwaja. So Triratna in Buddhism meant three gems. So these were the Buddha, the Sangha, and Dharma. So these were the three gems or three Ratna of Buddhism. And there was a special symbol that was used to symbolize the three Ratna. And we find that this was also used as a standard, and we see this in Sanchi. Now when we move to the Gupta period, we know that the Garud standard was an important standard for the Gupta Empire, and this standard also appeared on the coins of different Gupta rulers. Now apart from the Garud standard, we have also some reference to suggest that there also existed a horse standard and there were some other standard as well. Apart from the reference of the Gupta coins, we have another great reference from the Ajanta paintings. So here what we see is that the patakas or banners that are depicted, and these depictions suggest that the banners of this period were long and colorful, but the important point here is that we do not have any reference to suggest that there were also symbols that were depicted on these banners. Now when we move to the example of the Huna rulers, for example Torman, we from his coins learn that his symbol was a sun and a bull. So these are some of the examples to show that the concept of flags and standards was an important part of military tradition in ancient India as well. Thank you for watching.